That I'm extremely delighted to have this invitation from Tushar to speak today on this very wonderful man, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, and his quest for the ethical democracy. And I thought that by the way of introduction today, I will just briefly elaborate on his contributions. For example, even before the word like civil rights movement was born, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was somebody who perhaps launched one of the biggest civil rights movements in the world. And he was, of course, fighting for the rights of the communities which were treated like as the untouchables, or in some cases unseeable or even unapproachable. So he fought for their civil rights till the end of his life. And one of the professors from USA has likened his contribution to that of the contributions made by the luminaries in the civil rights movements in USA, like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Thurgood Marshall, Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, and so on. So we can understand that he has contributed significantly to what we can term as the civil rights movement, even before this word was in currency. His immense contribution came to the India's economic development, which Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar spent his intellectual force to ensure that India is launched on the developmental path when he was the member of the Viceroy's Executive Committee. After Ashoka, he might be the one who has greatly contributed to the revival of Buddhism in India, and because of his efforts, now the Buddhism in India has become a vibrant reality. But what I'm going to talk today, which is the topic of the talk today, is Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar and the quest for what we can say the ethical democracy. And he was a student of democracy from very early on, and when he started his public career in India, he started with democracy, the vision of democracy in his mind. But as we all know, that the word democracy itself has become very trite, a banal, a sort of a commonplace word, that it needs a lot of thinking to really unravel various threads or various ideas around this very term democracy. And being a student of democracy for very early on, and he studied with who is now known as the philosopher of democracy, John Dewey, in his Columbia University days. So he was influenced by the ideas of John Dewey about democracy and so on and so forth. But in his own way, he has contributed so much to what we can call today the philosophy of democracy. And he was somebody who was not just interested in ideas, but in understanding their implication for the social, political and economic transformation of the world. And therefore we can see a lot of dynamic ideas appearing in the thoughts of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. And I thought that I am going to explore some of them so that they will have a bearing on the topic that we have hands today. So Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar in the early 40s, even before India had attained the independence, talked about the democracy, and he was very early on talking about democracy. He was talking about the political liberty of the Indians in terms of instituting what is now known as the universal adult franchise, and he was advocating the universal adult franchise from very early on in his career, which started with in 1917. So in early 1940s, he briefly sketched what we can know as the history of democracy, and he talks about autocracy, from the regime of autocracy to the development of political democracy. And when he's talking about this history of political democracy, he traces the roots to the French Revolution and the contribution of the French Revolution in terms of the ideas of the self-government and the self-determination. These two ideas were very much part of the development of the democracy, in this case the political democracy. And when he was sketching these ideas, he found that though the political democracy was instituted in several countries, it failed to achieve what it was supposed to achieve. And then he found the contradictions between the visions of the democracy and how the political democracy has failed that vision, and that's what we are going to look at today. So, tracing out from the French Revolution all the way up to the development and the sabotage of democracy, in particularly before the World War II, in terms of the rise of Nazism. And when Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is talking about the rise of Nazism as something which was an anathema to the concept of democracy, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is talking about a very fundamental concept that I'm going to look at in a brief manner. So what he is talking about is that the rise of phenomena like fascism, which actually happened in the context of the political democracy. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar made a very key points there. So one of his key points was that the political democracy fails when there is no social or economic democracy. And he brought this contradiction between what is called the political democracy and the social and economic democracy. He says that the social and economic democracy are the tissues and the fiber of a political democracy. The tougher the tissue and the fabric, the greater the strength of political democracy. And he says that the Nazism has taken a term which was ugly in its form, because it was promoting what he called the racial segregation in terms of the German race at the top, white race below, and the brown race beneath that. And he was telling at that time to the Indians that they have to be on the guard with of the political democracy. But eventually he was somebody who has contributed to establish the political democracy in India itself, and his contribution to establishment of the political democracy in India is tremendous. As I said, that he was somebody who was struggling for the universal adult franchise. He was fighting for what is called the constitutional conventions, and he played key role since the history of the constitution making began in India. So as we look at his ideas today, we have to look at some of his ideas about how the political democracy can fail the very vision of democracy itself. And that particular idea of how it can fail the parliamentary democracy is elaborated in a few concepts. He says that the political democracy began with bringing the liberty, but he says that the freedom of contracts, which did not take inequality in the society into consideration, led to the enormous growth of inequality within those society. And he also says that as a result of that, the rich became more richer, and the poor became more poorer. And he says that what we need in order to have a strong democracy is to have the social and political and economic democracy. He says that the political democracy and the capitalist form of industrial organizations leads to two kinds of contradictions. One is the fabulous wealth in the hands of a few and abject poverty for the masses. And he says that in politics you may have equality, but in economics it might lead to inequality. So therefore he is very particular about how to promote the social and economic democracy. And he says that the rise of Nazism in the political democracies has something to do with the degree of the social and economic democracies in those countries. And he gives an illustration that wherever this phenomenon of Nazism or fascism emerged, it was because the degree of the social and economic democracies were not higher to the extent that they will stop the dictatorship that eventually came in those countries. So what is very important for us to discuss here is how we can relate with this sort of ideas. So when he is talking about the history of democracy, he's talking about the failure of the parliamentary democracies in those countries where the parliamentary democracies were existing, and he says that the establishment of the new order is the order of the day. And how do we establish the new order in which liberty, equality, and fraternity, which were his cherished values, will not be mere slogans but will also become the facts of life? And this is a very important conceptualization of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, that he talked in the way Isaiah Berlin talked about the positive and negative aspects of liberty. So he says that there has to be the fair conditions of life in order for democracy to succeed. And what are those fair conditions of life? Liberty. And he says that it's not merely the concept of restraints that we put on the people. He talks about not mere recognition of the right to have the vote for the people. He goes deeper and he talks about the positive conception of liberty. He says that the positive conception of liberty entails government by the people. He says that effectively the government has to be by the people, not in the namesake, isn't it? And the political democracy in a way gives the power to the term that he uses, ruling class, to rule perpetually. And that's why he talks about the social and economic democracy. So he goes further explaining liberty, saying that it should also have the right to equal opportunity. And he says that the state has a duty to provide the fullest facilitation for the individuals to realize their full potentials as human being. And this theme of realization of the full human potential runs very deeply in the thought process of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. So as we are looking at the history of democracy in the scheme of thinking of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, he also highlighted how democracy can fail. And today we can see that even some of the scholars are even talking about the death of the democracy. They are talking about how the democracy is now completely jeopardized, in a sense that the constitutional democratic institutions, if we study the rise of what is called the popular governments, and in many of the cases in those countries there are what is called the parliamentary democracies. In case of India, in case of many other countries, such has been the case, that the very political democracies have been in the crisis, and that's why we have to think in terms of how we are going to talk about the very essential elements of the ethical democracy. So as we know, as I have just briefly told you, that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was a multifaceted personality. He found several educational institutes. He was in essence the father of the Democratic Republic of India. And as I said, that he was pitching for democracy from very early on in his career. And at one point he said that the educational institute that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar found, he when he's talking about the objective of that institute, it was called the People's Education Society. And he says that the People's Education Society's objective is not merely to give education, but to give education in such a manner as to promote intellectual, moral, and social democracy. This is what modern India needs, and this is what all well-wishers of India must promote. So in a way, he's talking about the concept of democracy in many different ways. And he was not just limited to what is called the political democracy, though he has fought to ensure that the political democracy is the fact of the Indian political life. So as his contribution, we can see that he started advocating for the universal adult franchise, and India became a full-fledged political democracy when the first elections were conducted in 1952, when the universal adult franchise was made a fact by the Constitution of India that came into being in 1950. So the creation of a political structure of the self-governing society was thus completed in 1950. And the first elections of India, like 70 years back, has ensured that there is a political freedom for the Indian citizens. And that was, the Indians have to pay a very heavy price to ensure what is called the political freedom. And what is the political freedom according to Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar? It is the presence of the universal adult franchise. It is the presence of what is called the constitutional morality, where the constitution is respected, where the forms created by the constitution are respected. They are treated as if they are sacred. And the third is the representative government. So in another of his writings, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar termed these terms as the wheels of the democracy. So why I am talking about this? Because as early as 1943, even before the parliamentary democracy became a reality in our country, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar cautioned, beware of parliamentary democracy. It is not the best product as it appeared to be. And he says that because the democracy is a machine whose movements are very slow, it delays swift action. Therefore, sometimes the political democracies can give rise to the dictatorship, and that is why it is when the democracy rises, it discredits the institutions in countries as we have seen in the history of democracy like Italy, Spain and Germany. So before the World War II. So why I am putting up this history? Because some knowledge of the history will be very vital to understand what is happening to democracy today and what kind of a democracy we should all be trying to bring in the world today, not just limiting to the liberty, equality and fraternity as mere slogans, but taking them very deeply to understand them as the ethical values which can promote the fulfillment of the human potentials. So as I was deliberating on some of the things that are very important today, is to talk about the social and economic democracy, and the strength of the political democracy depends on the social and economic democracy. So in 1950, when the constitution was ratified in our country, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar brought out this contradiction between the political democracy on one hand and the social and economic democracy on the other hand. He says that we are now going to enter into a life of contradiction, where on one hand we will have one man, one vote, one person, one vote, he is saying, and on the other hand we have the complete denial of what he says, one man, one value. And of course he's referring to the caste system in India, which is sort of a very fragmentary social system. And Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar goes into depth as to how the social stratification or having that in the society can dismantle the very fabric of the democracy itself. So when he's talking about these contradictions, he's talking about certain things which are connected today. He says that if there is a liberty, and liberty only promotes the freedom of contracts without taking into consideration the glaring inequalities in the country, in the society, the liberty is ultimately going to swallow, to use the word that he used, equality. And he says that democracy is equality. Many definitions that he has put forth about democracy. One of his very finest, I would say, conception about democracy is equality. And without an equal society, the democracy will always be in danger. So he's referring to that contradiction which he found on the day when our constitution was ratified in 1950. And as I said, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar played the leading role, the key role in drafting the constitution of our country. So when we are talking about the social and economic democracy, he makes it very clear that the social and economic democracy, if it has to come into being, there has to be no existence of what he calls the governing class. And he says elsewhere that mere presence of the political democracy, if there is no social and economic democracy, it might lead to the perpetual coming of power of the same governing class. So he says that in order to ensure that the real democracy or the deep democracy becomes the fact of the country, the existence of the governing class is a great threat to the democracy. And he says that the presence of the governing class or a ruling class is the enemy of democracy. And he says that the rulers and the rulers and the ruled both cannot be into the watertight compartment. He says that there has to be the rotation of power between the various groups, because according to him, sociologically, any country consists of these social groups, and therefore the rotation of the power between the various groups is tantamounts to what he says the bringing the equality in the society. And he says that it is very important to safeguard the interest of the survival classes. He makes it a point that it's very important to safeguard the interest of the survival classes. And he says that it's very important that to understand what is the social philosophy of the governing classes. And when it comes to talking about the social philosophy of these India's so-called governing classes, it's the social philosophy is that of the caste system. And as Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was talking about the enemies of democracy in terms of Nazism, in terms of creating a kind of a racial segregation, the order of segregation, where the German race will be at the top, the white race will be the servile class, and below that brown race which will have no rights at all. And you bear this image in your mind about the enemies of democracy. You bring that that image to India, and you are talking about caste system. You are talking about the very essence of Brahmanism, which is nothing but the system of graded inequality. What the caste system is not as a normal form of inequality. It's not about high and low, as Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar says, that it's a graded inequality where the society is divided into the highest, higher, high, low, lower, lowest, and within each highs and lows you will find all these micro pyramids of highs and lows, and therefore it becomes very difficult even for the exploited or the marginalized or disinherited classes to mobilize themselves for their own rights, because the exploited are broken into many pieces because the caste system does it. So he talks about the social philosophy of the governing classes, and he makes it a point that what can be the best social philosophy that can promote the universal good of a common man. And I think we have to understand this concept of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar of a common man. For him, the democracy is a realization of the full human potential of every human being, irrespective of their caste, irrespective of their creed, irrespective of anything that might divide them into watertight compartments. And therefore, for him, the democracy, to follow up from his teacher, is a kind of a communication between various groups. So, coming back to the social and economic freedom, it's very important to know what is the social philosophy of the governing class in that particular country, what kind of the ethos, what kind of the ethics that it promotes. And if in case of our country, if it is promoting the caste system in any form, which can be called Brahmanism in a sense of as I just compared it with Nazism in terms of the global racial segregation that Hitler wanted to bring. And surprisingly, you will be very shocked to see that whenever you go to the bookstalls in India, you go to the the bookstalls in the railway station, anywhere you go, Hitler's book Mein Kampf is sold like hot cake. And very few people are aware that Hitler castigated the British government for giving political rights and education to the Indians, and despite of this glaring contradictions, that book is like sold like a hot cake in India even today. So social philosophy is very important, and therefore when we are talking about the social and economic democracy, we cannot but talk about the social philosophy. And Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has talked about his social philosophy. He says that my social philosophy is enshrined in 3 words: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And he goes on making a very radical statement. He says that I have not taken them from the French Revolution. I have taken them from my master, the Buddha. I'm going to come to that at the end of my talk. But before that, I'm going to talk a little bit on his efforts to bring the social and economic democracy in India. He says that mere giving the rights to the people, for the political rights to the people, is not going to bring them welfare. It's unless we have the social and economic rights. And he's talking about, as it has happened in the Britain of the post-war Britain in terms of the reconstruction. And there was a famous report that was submitted by William Beveridge, which has become a kind of a cornerstone to bring in power the Labour government, and by that way whatever we have seen the social security systems that were put in place in England. And Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was in the awe of that report, in a sense that it identified 5 enemies of the human beings, as it were. Number 1, want or poverty. If there is a glaring poverty, there cannot be freedom. As Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar says, that when there is ethics and economy in conflict, it's economy that always wins. And by the way of that, he wanted to ensure some kind of the economic rights to the people of India in the constitution of our country. But it didn't happen. And but it came into Article 41 of our constitution, where we have this all so-called 5 enemies of the humanity taken care of. But they come not in the fundamental rights section of our constitution. They come in the what is called the directive principle of the state policy. So let me enumerate the enemies of the social and economic freedom, economic democracy. Those are like want and poverty. If in the country there is a glaring poverty, if there is a chronic poverty, if there is a dire poverty, it's very difficult for the people to realize their full human potential. Second is disease. Third is ignorance and illiteracy. The fourth is squalor, lack of proper housing and sanitation. And the fifth is unemployment. So the real question is, whenever we are talking about democracy, and there are many ways by which Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has talked about democracy. One of his very fine way of talking about democracy was the democracy is an attitude of respect and reverence for a fellow human being. In other words, he's talking about right to have a dignity for all, and he has spoken it very well, and I'm going to read it for you. Before I'm going to elaborate more on social and economic democracy, which by the way I'm going to connect with what is called the ethical democracy. So he says that right of man must be translated into terms which common man can understand. So what are the terms by which a common man can understand their rights? He says peace, whether the societies are peaceful. He says a house, adequate clothing, education, good health, and above all, referring to one of the reports, says the right to walk with dignity on the world's great boulevards without fear of a fall. You see, this is so fundamental and foundational sort of a value in the scheme of social and economic democracy of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. This valued dignity so much so that it has become the part of the preamble of our constitution, which says that to ensure the liberty, equality, fraternity, and the dignity of the individual. So we can see that whenever we are talking about the social and economic democracy, we cannot but talk about the right to walk with dignity. Dignity is a very deep essence or meaning of the concept of democracy. As I said, that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has earmarked or underlined this very important conceptualization of democracy as the democracy being an attitude of respect and reverence towards a fellow human being, and that has a bearing on the 4 enemies that I just talked about, and they have become the part of what is called the Article 41 of our constitution, which is included in the directive principle of state policy. So coming to the contradictions again in our country, we have to think through the democracy in a way that it becomes a reality for the people. In other words, how to make the democracy work, how to promote the social and economic rights of the people, how to promote the social and economic well-being of the people, without which the political democracy loses its significance. It just become another machine to perpetuate, the semblance of a popular government, under which, lot of things can be done which are against the masses. So I am going to make this last point in terms of what is called the development of the social and economic democracy. So as Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar says, that there should not be inequality, there should not be glaring inequality, some kind of big gap between the rich and poor. He says that there has to be the existence of the opposition party, without which if there is just one party ruling every organ, it might become an autocracy. He says that there has to be a strong sense of equality before law, there has to be constitutional morality, safeguards for minorities, which is very important point, and ethical moral order, and there has to be public conscience. So before I end up, and I will open up the forum for the further discussion, because I think that whatever I am going to put forth in the great Ambedkarite tradition has to be examined by all, and all are free to point out to, place before us all what are their views about what I have been just talking in terms of social and economic democracy. And we will do that after I conclude. So before I conclude, I am going to talk about the ethical democracy. You see, the democracy, if it is just quantitative or numerical democracy, where we just count the votes of the people, and by the way of that we try to ensure that the majority comes into being. And if the majority comes, if the political majority comes into being by that way, it's okay, because the political majority by its very nature is changeable in its class composition, as I was talking about how the political machinery in terms of the ballot system can change the class composition, and the political majority, if there is a right ideology, can grow. And it's the political majority can be open to the changes, and the politics is free to all to make or unmake. But in India, in a country like India, where I'm talking about a social philosophy, the governing philosophy, it is not about the political majority, it's about the communal majority. And if anybody has some knowledge of India, that the caste system is based on the birth. It's not based on something on somebody's birth. The circumstances limit your growth. So the communal majority is born. When we are talking about the communal majority in terms of the caste or in terms of the creed, it's born. Secondly, it's closed. It is not open to changes, and the politics is made by its own members born in it. So now, you see, what we are facing in terms of a problem is the presence of a communal majority, which is there because of the birth. It is not created, as the political majorities are created, and the ballot system in terms of the political democracy, one man, one vote, one person, one vote, can be okay. But if there is, there is no ethical democracy in terms of the responsibility of the political majority to look at the interest of the minorities. And there is a very beautiful discussion in the philosophy of Dewey as to how this majority and minority existing in the democracy can create a ground for the changes in the political in the policy making. And we have seen one of the great genius of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was to ensure that those communities which had no representation, which were denied the representation by the very social structure that exists in India today, to bring that lot in the democratic process by ensuring the safeguards or by ensuring the representation for them in the civil services, in the legislation. By the way of that, the communal majority, as we can see, can be fractured by an ideology which talks about liberty, equality and fraternity, not just as the political sloganeering, but as the facts of life. So there comes what is called the morality. And the morality has a tremendous faith. The ethics has, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar imposed tremendous faith in morality. He says that the society can be governed either by law or by, the ethics or morality. And this is a very fascinating discussion. And we can discuss when we open the forum for discussion. He says that the morality is very important because the law can be for a few, and of course you have a constitution which was ratified after making a lot of efforts, a rigorous process of understanding various political mechanics of it. And we have a constitution which I will term as a very egalitarian constitution, But when it comes to what is called the real working of it, we can see that even the constitution can be sabotaged if there is no constitutional morality. So, when Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is talking about the morality, he's talking about, how we can bring the relationship between the two human beings, whatever caste, creed, class they might belong to, how we can break, in other words, the barriers that separates the human beings. And he is talking about the source of the ethics in religion. And this is very fascinating for me because you see there are now attempts made by the philosophers like Stephen Rockefeller, who is talking about the bringing of spiritual democracy in America. He's a Buddhist philosopher, practitioner, and he's talking about how we can now have this vision of a spiritual democracy, how we can have the vision of an ethical democracy. In the Ambedkarite parlance, how we can have the vision of what we can say the Nibbanic democracy, or the democracy that talks about, the enlightenment of the human being, the enlightenment of the society. So you see, this value of liberty, equality and fraternity, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has spoken very, very beautifully. He says that, the fabric of the reality is relational. We are all interdependent. We are not like, separate substance, impermanent substance. We are all interrelated. The human beings, as, to cite one of the great Buddhist philosophers, Thich Nhat Hanh, he says that we are all interbeing, and the fraternity, or to relate with each other, is the fundamental fact of human life. We cannot exist of our own. We exist by the way of our relationship with others. And how those relationships should be governed. Can they be based on power? Can they be based on any institutional structure? How can they be based? So the fundamental concept is, how we can look at each other the way we will look at ourselves. And there lies the conception of social democracy in terms of the Buddhist term that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar used, metta, me atta. So just like me. And when we have this attitude of treating other human beings, not based on their caste, creed, or place of their birth, but based on the fact that they are human beings like us, and they have a tremendous potential to develop their human potentials if the constraints, the external constraints, are taken care of. And he says, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar says that the morality or the ethics cannot be ordained by the external agency. In other words, he sees that there is no external force that can ordain the morality or the ethics between the human beings. So he says that we have to search in the existing religions what can be those codes of morality that can be applied today, so that the society is governed by the ethical system. And he found that in the teachings of the Buddha, and he has had this long elaboration of how he sees that the ethics can come alive in the teachings of the Buddha, in terms of how the Buddha teaches us to examine deeply everything, examine the human relationship, examine our own experiences, and guard our minds in a way that it will promote the kind of the democratic values of liberty, equality and fraternity, communicable to other human beings. In other words, create what Martin Luther would call the beloved community, what Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar will call a true democratic society. And I think this is a very important point, that he says that we have to look within, because the new prophet is not going to come. and he launches his journey into the comparative study of religions, and he found that the Buddha or the Buddhist teachings or the Buddhist philosophy can ensure the percolation of ethics in the society. So what I thought, it's a very vast topic. It's not a narrow topic. We are talking about something which we talk about every day, and it has got many nuances. It has got many definitions. It has got many viewpoints, and that is what is the beauty of democracy, because it enables us to really bring all our differences, all our opinions together, and look at everything from what is called the knowledge of the conditions instead of our biased opinions. So understanding the conditions, understanding the pulse of time, understanding what is happening today in the societies is very important in democracy. So in other words, as Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was talking about, 3 levels of democracy, three triad of democracies in terms of the intellectual democracy, moral democracy, and social democracy. They all make sense when we are talking about the democracy as something ethical. It has to do with ethics. It doesn't have to always do with parceling of the people into votes, into ballots, and therefore the democracy is such a fascinating concept. There is no other form of organizing a society. In the scheme of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, the democracy is not mere a form of government. It's the form of organizing a society in a way that every individual will have an opportunity to realize their full human potential. So what I will do, I will stop here, and I will open up the forum for any discussion, any clarification, anyone would like to share, today. So is that okay, Tushar? I will stop here.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and it was such a nice, intellectual and food for thought you served for all of us. Thank you so much. Indeed, it's Babasaheb's statement that social and economic democracy are tissues and fiber of the political democracy. This statement is relevant to any society in the world. Not only in India, but his views, his opinions are it's relevant to everywhere. It's everywhere on this earth. Thank you so much. Please keep ready your questions or your whatever your questions are there in our. We are having some from York. We have been joined by Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us. Susan is joining us from Newcastle Buddhist Center. And from India, from Bombay, we have Anu Mishra. Professor Christine is here from law school.